Thank you very much. Thank you to the Lutheran Office for World Community, to the Greek Orthodox Archdiocesan Council and Theodore, and to the World Council of Churches for the invitation to me to join this excellent panel and discuss this extremely critical issue with all of you today. Terrorism, of course, has been a prominent issue on the international agenda for many years. The Security Council has qualified it as a grave threat to international peace and security, and Resolution 1373, adopted in September 2001, just after the New York and Washington, D.C. terrorist attacks here in the United States, created the committee that I and my colleagues work for, the Counterterrorism Committee of the Security Council, to try to pull together a unified global effort against this threat. Our particular office, the Secretariat for that committee, was created in 2005 by Resolution 1566. And we have been advocating a series of very specific, concrete measures for states to take to confront the terrorist threat. And I'm happy also to say that although human rights was not mentioned in Resolution 1373, it was mentioned in subsequent Security Council resolutions as an essential prerequisite to effective state action against terrorism. Well, today we're facing, as we all know, an unprecedented threat with the growth of Daesh, a group which, as my colleagues here on the panel have very compellingly described, is responsible for crimes on a vast scale, for mass killings, enslavement, rape, and other forms of torture, abuses against children, recruitment and forcing of children to become soldiers. All of these certainly would seem to qualify as crimes against humanity and war crimes and even perhaps genocide. So what should be done to confront this threat? And the expert speakers on this panel have already addressed that question to a very large extent. There remains, of course, the use of force question, which is always a consideration of the Security Council, but that would require agreement among council members, which, as everyone knows, is sometimes difficult to achieve. We can refer, or could refer, to the principle that has been debated and is now advocated by the Secretary General, R2P, the responsibility to protect. It would certainly seem that these terrible crimes that are taking place in Syria and Iraq could perhaps serve as a basis for R2P action, but that's a big issue and I'm not going to tackle that. That's above my pay grade. However, the Security Council also relies on other actions that can be taken against the terrorist threat, including the threat posed by groups like Daesh. There's been a very heavy emphasis placed on the importance of cutting off financing to these groups. And as you have seen, we've all seen in Resolution 2253, adopted just a few months ago, and others, the Security Council is calling upon all member states to deny Daesh its funding sources, including by blocking the export of oil and other mineral resources. They're doing what they can to prevent access to international financial networks by this organization. They're trying to prevent the sale of looted antiquities. And in particular, the Security Council took the decision to include members of Daesh in the terrorist groups that are the focus of terrorist sanctions. That is to say that any named member of these organizations shall have their assets frozen wherever they may be found and shall be denied the possibility of international travel. So the sanctions list has expanded significantly. I might just mention, in connection with financial sanctions, that does touch on a topic that is also the subject of today's discussion, which is the question of providing humanitarian access to populations in need. All the speakers have highlighted the terrible conditions that people in Daesh-controlled territories face, and certainly the humanitarian actors in the United Nations system are committed to providing assistance to those populations. Sometimes that gets complicated when these groups are also the subject of sanctions as terrorist organizations, because arguably perhaps it could be said that such assistance somehow benefits the terrorist groups. That's a different debate, but it's certainly a very live one these days. And then there are efforts that the Security Council has taken against foreign terrorist fighters generally, against those who feed the ranks of Daesh. The key resolution in that respect was Resolution 2178, adopted in September 2014 at the level of heads of state at a Security Council meeting chaired by President Obama. And that resolution, adopted under Chapter 7 of the Charter, required member states around the world to criminalize foreign terrorist fighters, well, not criminalize them, but to criminalize the travel by any individual to join a terrorist group, and to take certain border control measures to prevent such travel, to introduce so-called API systems, advanced passenger information logs, so that airlines can prevent the travel of people on certain lists, and to share intelligence. This is obviously a critical resolution. It's one that our committee focuses a great deal on. It does present human rights issues, needless to say, because sometimes it is a difficult matter of criminal law to prove that someone who is, let's say, getting on a flight in any city around the world headed toward Turkey or toward the Middle East is a foreign terrorist fighter. How do you prove that before a person travels? But nonetheless, that was a step that the Council considered could help address the crimes of Daesh. And the last important area I'd like to mention, and it's been discussed a little bit today, is this area that is getting a lot of attention, CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. How can the world community, not only states, but civil society, faith-based groups, women, youth, others, somehow have an impact on Daesh's ability to recruit, to brainwash usually young people, and to starve them of human capital, so to speak. So Resolution 2178, in a rather unprecedented few paragraphs, specifically called upon states to implement programs of CVE, of countering violent extremism, and in a language that's rather unusual for the Security Council, it called upon states to empower civil society groups, community leaders, religious leaders, women, youth, families, to bring them into the struggle against this organization. Now, one way in which that can take place, of course, is through counter-messaging, and we can have a discussion about how to effectively counter-message. That's a big debate internationally, and particularly among civil society. Who are credible messengers? What should be the role of religious leaders, of community leaders? My colleague referred to the important letter that was signed by many Islamic scholars. Certainly these have an effect. How great is their effect overall? But the resolution also spoke of strategic partnerships, engagement, empowerment, and I heard these words on the panel, and I personally am convinced, and I think that the Security Council's Counterterrorism Committee has given its endorsement to this idea that engagement and empowerment is a critical element of confronting the Daesh threat. This is certainly true in countries where foreign fighters originate. Government should make a concerted effort together with local communities to try to identify young people at risk and to see if they can intervene before they travel. And also, of course, in the communities affected in Syria and Iraq, although that is a lot easier said than done. The Council has also called upon the world community to prevent the subversion of educational, cultural, and religious institutions by terrorists that can lead to recruitment. This gets states into the difficult area of essentially controlling, maybe closing down religious institutions. I want to put the question forward, how can the victim populations in the areas controlled by Daesh be reached? All the victims, including women, young people. Is there any possibility to support them in any efforts they might make, or is it too dangerous to stand up and have your voice heard in these areas? In a significant resolution, the Council late last year adopted Resolution 2242, as many of you know, on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and it called on the Council's Counterterrorism Committee, our committee, to mainstream gender and women throughout all of our work. And so we have a mandate now from the Council to involve women in counter-messaging, in countering violent extremism initiatives. But that sometimes obviously is extremely challenging. And I'm sure many of you know about Resolution 2250 just a few weeks later, in which the Council highlighted the important role of youth in these efforts. Our committee engages with states to try to strengthen their measures, their policies, their institutions against terrorism. We recently had the privilege to visit Iraq, which is right at the center there, as we all know. Clearly Iraq has some progress to make in terms of institution building, in terms of engaging with civil society, although there seems to be an interest in that country to work on counter-radicalization measures, de-radicalization in prisons. And I should say I'm not that comfortable with the notion or with the word de-radicalization. I know it's a little uncomfortable. What are we talking about? Turning off a switch in people's brains. But this has to be dealt with. If people are in detention, what do you do? How do you reach them? How do you try to get them to abandon their violent extremist ways? And there's also quite a bit of attention that I won't go into now on the whole role of information and communication technologies, ICTs, as we call them, and we all know that the internet and social media have played a role in recruitment. They can be abused by terrorists. This is all slow going. It's a slow process, but in addition to the ideas that my colleagues on the panel have mentioned, I think it is important to try to find ways, maybe people in this room have great ideas, in fact I'm sure you do, about how to show solidarity with affected communities and in a way that respects those communities, by the way. There's been a little bit of criticism and concern raised about the whole CVE and PVE agenda. PVE is preventing violent extremism. The Secretary General just put forward an important major new plan of action on PVE, which has lots of human rights elements, lots of engagement with different social actors. Some have said, yes, but are you talking about recruiting these actors to become extensions of the security apparatus? Well, I think we all agree that we have to avoid that. There has to be a partnership established with affected communities. They seem, who wouldn't want to support or work together with the national community to prevent terrorism, but at the same time, we have to be careful about securitizing these actors. Just the last point I'd like to mention is the question of forced migration, an important issue that my colleague just raised. I mentioned Resolution 1373 that was adopted in September 2001. The only time that resolution mentions human rights is in a reference to the importance of ensuring that refugee processes are not abused by terrorists and their supporters. The resolution said states should respect human rights and international refugee law in doing that. This is part of the challenge that states are facing. I think Emeka is absolutely right. We all know there are hundreds of thousands of people who need protection, who are fleeing for their lives. States do have an obligation also to ensure that terrorists are not abusing that process, but can you imagine a bigger challenge? That is very difficult when you have thousands of people flooding over your border to try to assess whether some of these individuals may be affiliated with a terrorist organization. Not easy, especially if you want to respect international human rights law. So I'm really here because I'm also interested in the conversation that will follow our remarks, so I'll stop there and thank you again for the invitation.